Welcome back to the Wild Globalization Project. Today, we're talking about wild culture and civilization part 2. In part 1, we asked, how do the flows of populations and peoples, their languages, beliefs, drive our 21st century globalizing civilization? Today, we're asking, what do we think we mean by culture or civilization? Our sense here is that to understand globalization, we've got to tackle civilization. So ask yourself, how did we get here? From a skin-of-our-teeth survival of ice ages, volcanic winters, horrific famines and pandemics, to modern civilization today. Or what happens when the, quote, get here explodes exponentially, from crude flying machines to space travel in just 65 years, or from Alan Turing's automatic computing engine to artificial intelligence in just 75 years. In spite of our successes, aren't we also disillusioned, living a strange 21st century angst, haunted by a darker side of this civilization, this globalization? It's that angst in the gut of our prosperity that's our concern, our care, and our wild globalization passion. So what's going on? How does the human world work? How and why is it changing? We're wondering if human existence isn't evolutionary, maybe even more evolutionary than ever, and if so, how? Here are our provocative claims. First, we're wondering if the human life world doesn't work more like a black box, what science calls a quantum entanglement. Like a wild river, but really many rivers crashing and flowing in a singular momentum, an ecology, technology, culture, economy, governance, a wealth river. Wild flows that carve out canyons, tear things up, but then incessantly build and rebuild the life world. But then there's that human again, and she's diving into it, riding a kayak. She's showing us how humans have not emerged from the wild. We are wild Homo sapien. The wild is happening right here and now. We've spread over and globalized the planet for 250,000 years. We're carried by, we live in, but we're also ourselves creating these wild entanglements. Second, to get here, we've relied on two unique abilities. Our ability to learn and think critically, or not. And our ability to love and care for each other and the planet, or not. Third, living in these entanglements of forces and energies, we are, by definition, forced to think it all at once. And finally, because we're living it in every moment of the day, it all races ahead of our critical thinking, our ethical response, and our common sense. How can we catch up with it? Or is it really more a case of, as Yuri Levine suggests, quote, falling in love with and learning to live the problem, like the kayaker riding the flows? So to understand globalization and civilization, we can look back at the human evolutionary story, various periods, from the wild past to the wilder present. The first period, 250,000 to 75,000 years before the Common Era, roughly 10,000 generations, out of the wild. Homo sapien emerges fleet of foot with large brains and fine motor skills, already exploiting fire and making stone tools. They possess a seemingly unconstrained desire to survive, but they have a new way. Survival by learning and knowing. We are the knowledge species that will walk and run out of the deep savanna to conquer our competitors and globalize the world. In this period, humans began to adapt using what paleoanthropologists call behavioral modernity, a suite of complex cognitive and social behaviors unique in the natural world. Humans could think, anticipate, and plan ahead. Remarkably, they also began to express themselves in symbolic art, ornamentation, as well as music and dance. Large game hunting and social teamworking appear. Human culture emerges with advanced language, social learning, and social organization. So the next period, 50 to 65,000 years ago, before the Common Era, roughly 2,000 generations, from just a few to culture. Survival, however, was a wild and skin-of-our-teeth game. The archaeological record is replete with what genetic biologists call population bottlenecks. As we saw in part one, bottlenecks happen when a species' numbers decline sharply due to famine, disease, even genocide. Our human lineage suffered several bottlenecks. Approximately 900,000 years ago, human numbers may have declined to as few as 1,000 to 100,000 individuals. And then another approximately 50 to 65,000 years ago, just before Homo sapien emerged out of Africa. By then, all of our competitors, the Neanderthals, Homo habilis erectus, heidelbergensis, the Denisovans, had vanished. Many at our violent hand, and some, like the Neanderthals, surviving in our own DNA. Homo sapiens had outlasted nature's overwhelming odds by commanding an indomitable and fierce will to survive. Humans had acquired a virtually unconstrained will and power, carried by a new hyper-natural evolutionary force of nature, a new way, the way of social learning and knowledge. By the African breakout, human culture had fully emerged, long before formal history or civilization. Advanced thought, planning, and creativity, again, behavioral modernity, are evident in the fossil record. In 1994, spelunking archaeologists discovered France's magnificent 30,000-year-old Chauvet cave paintings that rival the great modern artists. Cave paintings are turning up all over the world. The oldest, an eerie, red-stenciled Neanderthal hand from Spain's Maltravieso cave, 64,000 years old. Other powerful motivations appear alongside intelligence and learning. Archaeology reveals how our ancestors were profoundly bonded to their social groups and to the universe that surrounded them. In spite of their violent ways, they were spiritual beings. They lived under what we might call, quote, sacred value orders. Sacred because we know how, through the mythic stories and rituals, they revered and lived in and of the natural world, dependent on other animate life for resources. They celebrated the natural world, beneath the sun, the moon, the glistening night sky. They bonded and banded together in blood and sacrosanct alliances. They honored their dead in sacred burial rituals. Value, because their lives were constantly directed by value-based survival decisions in the face of limited resources. Value had an obvious material or economic nature, but it also turned on their reverence for the natural world, as well as their love and loyalty for their clan and social alliances. Finally, order, because we know that humans survived only by banding together for protection. Humans, in our most basic existential nature, all live in some order of spiritual cooperation. We can love one another, our family members, our clan. We bond in families, tribes, and nations. We stick together. We live in the ever-present risk of harm or death to ourselves and our loved ones. Spiritual because we want our lives to carry some meaning or significance. We want to be connected to the vast and mysterious orders of life on earth and the universe. Sacred value orders are the uniquely human quantum entanglements that enter and over and underflow and emerge spontaneously in every aspect of the human story. In global civilization today, many live inside formal traditions we call religions: Judeo-Christian, Islamic, Hindu, Buddhist, Tao, Jain. These traditions transcend political orders. Then again, many moderns live spiritual lives outside formal traditions. Yet we all hold in our hearts and minds ultimate cares and concerns. We all make choices and decisions about the final value and meaning of our lives and the life of our communities. Those ultimate concerns and values lead to orders of family, society, even the greater global community. Sacred value orders are blood and guts real. People fight and die for them. Sacred value orders have evolved ingenious and powerful orders and instincts that empower amazing creativities, but also terrifying destructiveness. Indeed, sacred value orders are stunning and beautiful, like Paris's Notre Dame Cathedral or India's Taj Mahal. Yet they can be horrific and evil, like the Middle East's holy war raging today. Nevertheless, by the end of the Paleolithic or Stone Age, human cultures were advancing a new version of evolution, radically different from any creatures who had ever lived on Earth. We had begun to intentionally seize, direct, and expand the creative and destructive cycles of life. Today, we don't merely adapt. We change the game. We fly without wings. We've landed on the moon. We dive the oceans deeper than whales. We're toying with the very DNA of life. Our modern agriculture has not only saved us from famine, but exploded our numbers. And our space telescopes see into the belly of creation itself. So the next period we want to look at is 10,000 before the Common Era, 400 generations ago. From hunters to farmers to civilization. So by 10,000 before the Common Era, or 400 generations ago, paleoclimatologists tell us that the Earth's climate shifted into the present interglacial optimum. Life got warmer, easier, less ice, more to eat. Optimums are 10 to 15,000 year pauses between ice ages. In North America, the 10,000 foot deep Laurentide ice sheet retreated after carving out the Great Lakes. And you can see our Wild Ecology YouTube for more detail. Human populations began to diversify into, quote, far-flung networks of societies spanning diverse ecologies with people, plants, animals, drugs, objects of value, songs and ideas moving between them in endlessly intricate ways, unquote. Early population concentrations were likely not permanent cities, but were more likely special sites where nomadic or semi-nomadic peoples gathered at propitious seasonal moments in less formal, quote, confederacies, and where some kind of formal organization was put in charge of the care and maintenance of sacred places. Those quotes are from David Graeber and David Wengrow. In this period, settling, centralization, scale, and finally civilization. Human cultures began to hunt less and instead husband goats and pigs. They started to grow rather than just gather wild grains. Early agriculture emerges from roughly 12 to 5,000 before the Common Era. Earth's great river valleys, Mesopotamia's Tigris Euphrates, Egypt's Nile, China's Yellow, and India's Ganges and Indus were settled first. More people living in larger demographic arrangements transformed the human order. Settling would change human culture and really human nature. Urban social orders supported by centralized agriculture simply favors different human behaviors and personality types than those favored by hunters or gatherers in the field. Centralized, settled societies required greater social cooperation and organization. Specialized labor and markets appear. These new synergies favored people with better planning and organizational skills to manage centralized resources and govern populations. Modern historians like David Watton refer to this transformation as the beginning of, quote, civilization and human history. Quoting Watton, "The most important transformation in human history before the invention of science took place comparatively recently, between 12 and 7,000 years ago. Animals were domesticated, agriculture began, and stone tools began to be replaced by metal ones. There have been roughly 600 generations since human beings first ceased to be hunter-gatherers. Humans who have left written records behind them as opposed to humans who have left only artifacts behind. This has existed only for about 300 generations. Add the word great in front of grandparent 300 times, it will fill just over half a page of print. This is the true length of human history." Unquote. What's hard to see in Watton's observation is the ominous explosion of civilization's velocity and scale of change. We hadn't just learned a bunch of data, we had learned how to learn. With the synergies of agriculture and centralized planning, human civilization launches an entirely new and accelerated version of evolution. Compared to natural, genetic-based evolution, the human version can change things in just a few short generations. Or, as with modern inventions like the smartphone or the atomic bomb, overnight. Hyper-evolution was on. If human emergence has tracked for, say, 250,000 years, then Watton's 7,500 years of history comprises about 3% of that run, roughly the last 45 minutes of a 24-hour day. So from the Ag Revolution forward, the scale and speed of civilization accelerates. From scattered bands of competing hunter-gatherers to Homo sapien alone, from hundreds of thousands to 8 billion today, from earth walking, running creatures to sky flying and ocean diving and moon walking, bouncing creatures. Urban population orders created new possibilities, but also wild new risks. Famine, pollution, and systemic disease. Satellite archaeology is uncovering in the deeply forested Americas entire civilizations that apparently rose to marvelous complexity and size and then simply vanished. The recent 1959 to 61 Great Chinese Famine that took 20 to 50 million was triggered by climate, poor farm practices, and Chairman Mao's Great Leap Forward. Consider how by the end of the 1800s, modern New York City, with 3.5 million people needing transportation, was also populated and polluted by 170,000 horses. Manure dust clouds caused respiratory disease in the summer, while rainy season rivers of horse manure would seep into basements, attracting disease-carrying rats and insects. But then, as if out of nowhere, wild inventor, innovator, entrepreneurs like Henry Ford came along with the Model T. Horses and manure vanished in a generation. Think of civilizational scale disease. COVID-19 killed 10 to 20 million out of 8 billion. But the plagues of Justinian, from 541 to 549 of the Common Era, or the Black Death, from 1346 to 1353 of the Common Era, routinely killed 30 to 50% of populations. In spite of these risks, complex cultures evolve into increasingly larger, more systematized, stratified, and scaled social arrangements, or what we call civilizations. Urbanization brings smart and creative people together synergistically, but they also grow dependent on supply chains for daily resources. You can see Wild Economy, YouTube, for that. More powerful and concentrated civilizations give rise to fierce competition for resources, and wars are not uncommon. More powerful governance hierarchies are required to manage both external enemy threats and to manage internal resource demands. Elite ruling classes develop. Civilizations differentiate from cultures by establishing permanent institutions of governance. The sacred value orders we mentioned above also evolve into more formalized and sovereign, quote, religious institutions that support more complex social orders, but at the extreme deploy human slavery, profound class discrimination, and even morbid human sacrifice and unimaginable atrocities. Moving through the centuries and millennia, these new civilized orders capture near absolute control over populations. Incredibly, Rome developed modern, sophisticated legal systems, while at the same time tyrannizing Mediterranean peoples. At the extreme, rulers like Caligula declare themselves God, and Rome's elite entertain themselves with the Colosseum's horrors. In the Americas, religious child sacrifice is not uncommon. But then, at the end of the Iron Age, radically new, revolutionary, sacred value leaders appear in the lives of the Buddha and Jesus. They announce the possibility of new social and spiritual orders which favor individual agency, human freedom, and a, quote, divine presence available to everyone, values we take for granted today. Their announcements presage a turn, a new horizon of possibility for human civilization. So, quick summary. Civilization is a double-edged sword, like Roman law and Roman torture and crucifixion. Civilization rings of civility, order, complexity, creativity, and beauty, like Notre Dame or the Taj, yet its brilliance can foreshadow a wildly unconstrained path of destruction and evil, like the 20th century's Holocaust. Civilization is about scale, immense populations, accelerating velocities of change. In fact, a radically different, hypernatural, evolutionary momentum. It's gaining speed and complexity as it races ahead of our common sense, our conscience, and our ability to adapt. It's wild, and we think getting wilder. So the last two periods we want to look at are the Great Divergence from 1800 to 1990 of the Common Era, 10 generations from ag to AI. Fast forward to the Common Era, roughly 500 to 1500 CE. Agriculture was still predominant. And under the agricultural model, economic and political power were based on people farming and producing crops. Throughout the Middle Ages, half the global population lived in China and India and produced half the world's economic output. Europe produced less than 10%. Most people, maybe 90%, lived agrarian, usually subsistence lifestyles. Prosperity came and went with poor weather or crop yields, and famine was not uncommon. After the fall of Rome in the 4th century of the Common Era, however, and partly due to its climate and geography, over the next 1,000 years, Europeans would devise and develop new technologies: wind and water power, advanced metallurgy, gunpowder and weaponry. New agricultural methods like crop rotation, selective breeding, improved plow designs. Better transportation, including road systems and wagons. They switched from oxen to horses and could move goods over water with more reliable, quote, round ships. By the 13th to 15th centuries, productivity had increased and new markets appear. The 14th century's Black Death decimated labor markets, but it hastened the decline of the stultified feudal system. Europe was poised. And for more on that, you can see Wild Economy 1 and 2. Things got really wild when Copernicus, Galileo, Da Vinci, or rectors and priests like Sir Isaac Newton, who developed modern physics, or Reverend Thomas Malthus, who studied population theory, or the Reverend Edmund Cartwright, who invented the power loom, or the Reverend William Greenwall, who invented modern archaeology, or even a library janitor like James Kroll, who thought up climate science. All of these were more or less independent, curious, free agent investigators. They would ignite the scientific revolution. Copernicus reset our understanding of the universe, and today, Elon Musk's SpaceX rockets are pointed at Mars. By the end of the Middle Ages, roughly 1500 to 1700 of the Common Era, Europeans were poised and ready over the next 200 years, or just 8 to 10 generations, to change the entire trajectory of global civilization. The Great Divergence was on. From roughly 1800 to 1990, the emerging science and technology-based economy transformed civilizational order and dominance. By 1900, Europe, the US, and Japan were producing 50% of global economic product. China and India, less than 20%. China and India's output hadn't declined. Instead, the West's production had exploded exponentially. We're still living the industrial revolutions that have transformed global civilization. Industry and manufacturing in the 18th to 19th century, technology in the 19th to 20th, digitization in the late 20th, and now the 21st century's AI revolution. And it's all been powered by energy. First wind and water power, then coal and steam, to oil and natural gas, and now at the margin, alternatives. Energy doesn't just generate electricity or move things and people. Modern fertilizers and pesticides, for good and bad, have sparked the, quote, green or third agricultural revolution that has at least for now eliminated systemic famine and grown global populations to 8 billion today. By the end of the 19th and 20th centuries, in just 8 generations, human civilization and the planet itself have been radically transformed and disrupted. In the US, most everyone has moved off the farm, less than 5% farm today. And mobilized by industrial agriculture, every week 1 million people are moving into cities worldwide. So what are the takeaways here from the Great Divergence? First, a minimal observation would notice that these technological and economic developments were gradual, incremental, and so more evolutionary than, quote, world-beating or intentional. Europeans quietly scrapped and borrowed and improved existing techs. Chinese clocks, gunpowder, compasses, printing. And they also came up with some of their own, like the Viking round ship. Innovation started in modest workshops, like Gutenberg's printing press or Newcomen's and Watt's steam engines. But they then launched massive revolutions in knowledge and brute power. The Great Divergence snuck up on global civilization and then totally transformed its path. In America, for example, when a boatload of pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock in 1620, did anyone foresee that in just 250 years, or 10 generations, the continent would be utterly overrun, cities rising over the plains, its heartland partitioned into quarter-section farms and laced with steel railroads? A maximal observation would notice that the West was first to advance modern technological civilization, but it often failed miserably to manage the awesome and essentially unconstrained powers these new techs and economies presented. We'll never know how the ancient civilizations, for example, the 5,000-year-old Chinese culture, might have led or misled things differently. We do know that the scrappy, insolent Europeans, with their big cannons and arrogant egos, moved into and over lands and markets and resources, routinely, often soullessly, overrunning native peoples and ecologies. From these observations, however, can we conclude that the Europeans sat down and planned the whole thing? Their clever inventions in modern economics radically changed history, yet these evolutionary changes devastated Europe's people as well. Tens of millions would perish in its advance. Isn't the takeaway here that Europeans didn't direct it as much as it happened to them? This great divergence of science, technology, and economy moved swiftly, yet surreptitiously ahead of the human ethical response or rational control. It was evolutionary. No, the primary difference between humanity's earlier atrocious attempts at civilization, on the one hand, great works of art and architecture or Roman law, but on the other hand, backshadowed by human slavery, child sacrifice, and genocide. No, the primary differentiator was that the Europeans had figured out how to, quote, go bigger, to leverage humanity's unconstrained and hypernatural powers and potential to industrial levels. The takeaway here is that modern civilization is a new version of the wild, industrial scaled, exponentially growing, J-curved faster, and getting wilder. The next period, the final period we'll look at, is the Great Convergence, from 1990 to 2020, just the last one or two generations, and what we call hyper-globalization. But then it got even wilder. The European miracle invited the rest of the world to its party. Rogue, independent, problem-solving thinkers like the brilliant Brit Alan Turing, working desperately to stave off the 1940s Nazi advance, dreamed up computers and information technology. Then in just 1 to 2 generations, folks evolved computers from Turing's automatic computing engine, or ACE, to the 1960s ARPANET, the Advanced Research Project Agency Network, and finally to the World Wide Web, the internet highway of information and knowledge open to the public and industry. Yet even with all this technical evolution, few imagined the, quote, Great Convergence that was on the horizon. By 2005, half the developed world was connected. By 2021, 90% of the developed world and nearly 60% of the developing world was online. Modern economic historians, including Richard Baldwin, theorize that recent modern technological civilization has evolved in 3 phases. Phase 1 was the Great Divergence from 1800 to 1990, which moved resources and products first with steamships and railroads, and then with massive container ships, and finally aircraft, and all of it powered by plentiful energy. Phase 2, the Great Convergence, 1990 to 2020, was launched by the internet moving ideas and information between Western-based designers, entrepreneurs, and Asian-based manual labor and production resources. In just 1 to 2 generations, Asia moves through the modernization cycle. Finally, phase 3. Interconnected robotics and artificial intelligence, or AI, from 2020 to the present, are now moving people virtually. Doctors in New York are performing robotically aided surgeries remotely anywhere in the world. The Great Divergence appears surreptitiously with 1 billion people on the planet, most working farms. The Great Convergence brings things back together. By the end of all the gains and losses, 8 billion of us are living longer and with more to eat than ever. Folks from 1800 wouldn't recognize us today. It's simply wild. Summing up, the knowledge or wisdom species. From hunter-gatherers to culture to scaled and institutionalized civilization, and in just 200 to 600 generations, a blink of the eye on most evolutionary maps. We hypernatural humans are quick and smart. We are the learning and knowledge creatures. Still, can we keep up with it all? We're racing, faster, but where? How? Is this angst in the pit of our stomachs telling us something? We stick together, we're social because that way we've always had a better shot at surviving. We can love and care for one another, or not. History reminds us that the not is always there, lurking. Our desire to know and live is constrained only by some divine reality for some, or our own will for others, or not. So are we then just the knowing species, or can we become something more, perhaps the wisdom species? Wild humanity, all this wild talk and thinking and imagery really boils down to whether we can be not just smart, but also wise. Information is not knowledge. Knowledge is not wisdom. So we've hit upon the core theme of our Wild Globalization project: knowledge, wisdom, and the wild future ahead. Stay tuned for coming attractions. Wild economy, wild governance, and wild wealth. We'll explore those questions. And stay safe. It's wild out there.